They thought they had everything under control. A white officer, standing guard at the courthouse, saw a lone woman approach, a black woman, holding an ID badge. He blocked her path without a second thought. What he didn't realize was that this wasn't just any visitor. This was Judge Leah Marshall, and what happened next would shake the courthouse to its core. Leah Marshall glanced anxiously at the clock on her dashboard. She was late, again, 10 minutes until the trial began. As she pulled up to the New Orleans courthouse, her pulse quickened. Today was no ordinary day. It was the opening of a high-stakes case that had the potential to reshape Louisiana's approach to racial profiling. This case wasn't just another file on her desk. For Leah, it was personal. Exiting her car, Leah took a moment to steady herself. As a black judge who'd climbed her way up in the legal world, she was no stranger to adversity. But today, the weight of her position felt especially heavy. She had prepared meticulously for this trial, yet an unsettling sense of anticipation lingered. From where you are watching the video, please write in the comment and like the video. The defendant, Kevin Daniels, was a young black man accused of fitting the description in his own neighborhood. The arresting officer's explanation echoed too many she'd heard before. Vague descriptions used as excuses, a story too familiar for Leah to ignore. She strode purposefully across the parking lot, the click of her heels echoing as she made her way to a quieter side entrance, hoping to avoid the media frenzy outside. Reporters swarmed the main steps, cameras poised for the story that was about to unfold. But Leah couldn't afford to lose time. As she neared the side entrance, her gaze landed on a young white police officer standing guard. His posture was rigid, his eyes tracking her every move. Leah reached instinctively for the ID badge around her neck, a simple gesture she'd done countless times. But before she could even lift it for him to see, he stepped directly into her path. "Ma'am, I'll need to see some identification," he demanded, his tone clipped and unwavering. Leah raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. "I'm Judge Marshall," she replied, holding her badge higher. "I'm presiding over the Daniels case today." But the officer barely glanced at her badge. Instead, his gaze was cold, calculated, scanning her as though looking for something suspicious. Leah felt a familiar burn of anger rise, but kept her face calm. "Hello friends, right now, write in the comments your name and where you are watching this video from. We really appreciate each of you. You are incredibly important to us and to the promotion of our channel. Thanks to you, we can tell such stories and open our eyes to injustice. You are our inspiration, and together, we can make this world a better place. Enjoy watching." "There's been an incident nearby," he said, his tone sharp with accusation, "and you match the description of someone involved. I'll need you to answer a few questions." Leah blinked, momentarily stunned. She was here to preside over a case on racial profiling, and here she was, being racially profiled at the courthouse doors. She steadied herself, her voice firm yet controlled. "Officer, I don't have time for this. The trial begins in less than 10 minutes, and I need to be inside." She held out her badge again, hoping he would recognize his mistake and step aside. But the officer's stance remained firm, his hand hovering near his belt, close to the handcuffs. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he snapped, moving closer. "You're coming with me." Leah's breath caught. This was escalating quickly. She recognized that look in his eyes, a look she'd seen too many times growing up in the South. It wasn't about her title. It was about her skin color. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Leah turned to see an older black officer approaching, his face etched with both concern and surprise. "Marshall?" His eyes widened, taking in the scene before him. "Judge Marshall?" "Yes," Leah replied, her voice tight with the weight of the moment. The older officer threw a quick glance at his younger counterpart. "Stand down," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The younger officer, still bristling, took a reluctant step back, leaving Leah to take a deep breath, aware that the morning's tension was only a preview of what lay ahead. "She matches the description," the younger officer muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "That's the judge," the older officer snapped, his tone sharp. "Do you want to lose your job?" The younger officer mumbled something under his breath, reluctantly backing off. Leah forced herself to take a slow, steady breath, her fingers flexing as she tried to release the tension. Losing her temper now would only give someone like him more power over her. "Are you all right, ma'am?" The older officer's voice softened, his eyes showing genuine concern. Leah managed a tight nod. "I'm fine, thank you." Without another word, she turned and strode into the courthouse, her heart still racing. The familiar sterile hallways greeted her, offering a sense of routine and order. But as she walked, the memory of the confrontation replayed in her mind, looping back with every step. She'd encountered racism all her life, but for it to happen here, on this day, in front of the courthouse where she was presiding over such a case, it was almost too much to bear. Leah inhaled deeply, composed herself, and took her place on the bench. The courtroom quieted as she banged her gavel, bringing the room to order. The trial began smoothly, with opening statements from both sides, but Leah's mind drifted back to the officer outside. She couldn't forget his sneering face, the instant judgment he'd cast on her. It was eerily similar to the case unfolding before her. Then came the first witness, Kevin Daniels himself. Leah leaned forward as he took the stand, his face etched with tension. His testimony was raw, filled with a pain that cut through the room. He described being stopped in his own neighborhood, for nothing more than walking home. He hadn't done anything suspicious, hadn't behaved in any way that warranted attention. And yet he'd been treated like a criminal, handcuffed and humiliated in front of the very neighbors he'd grown up with. Leah felt the weight of his words. She had heard stories like this countless times, but today, it felt personal. It wasn't just about Kevin Daniels. It was about countless others. It was about her. Midway through Kevin's testimony, a creak echoed from the back of the courtroom, and Leah's heart sank. The young officer from earlier, the one who had stopped her outside, entered the room. His face was pale, his expression tense as he made his way to the witness stand. Leah's gaze followed him, her entire body tensing. The prosecutor stood. "We would like to call Officer Bill Wilkins to the stand." Leah's eyes narrowed slightly. Bill Wilkins. She hadn't even caught his name before. Now he was here, seated in the witness chair, his posture stiff, his movements awkward. Leah reminded herself to remain impartial, to maintain her professionalism. But it was hard. This was the same man who had looked at her and seen a suspect instead of a judge. Wilkins shifted uncomfortably as the prosecutor began his questioning, asking him to describe his involvement in Kevin Daniels' arrest. "I was patrolling the neighborhood when I saw Daniels," Wilkins began, his voice lacking the confidence he'd displayed earlier. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong there. Leah's grip on her gavel tightened. Out of place. She had heard that phrase countless times before. It was code, a way to say, "He was black, and I didn't think he belonged." The prosecutor's tone sharpened as he pressed further. "And what exactly made Mr. Daniels look out of place, Officer Wilkins?" Bill shifted again, fidgeting under the scrutiny. He was acting nervous, looking around. It seemed like he was up to something. Leah felt a surge of anger. She had reviewed the case file thoroughly. Daniels had been waiting for his rideshare, a harmless act. There was no crime, no suspicious behavior, just a young black man deemed suspicious by default. In the eyes of the police, he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The prosecutor, unrelenting, continued his line of questioning. "Did you find anything on Mr. Daniels that suggested he'd committed a crime?" The prosecutor's voice cut through the silence. Bill hesitated, his face flushing red. Finally he admitted, "No, we didn't." A stillness fell over the room, thick with unspoken tension. Leah could feel it pressing down, each second stretching painfully. She glanced over at the jury, observing their reactions. Some faces showed clear emotion, others appeared conflicted. But the truth was undeniable. Kevin Daniels had been arrested for no reason other than the color of his skin. Bill's testimony continued, unraveling more with each question the prosecutor posed. Small cracks in his story began to emerge, discrepancies growing with each word. Leah watched him closely, noticing how his gaze kept flickering toward her, filled with discomfort. He knew who she was now, and he knew exactly what he had done. By the time the prosecutor finished, Bill looked nothing like the confident officer who had stopped her outside the courthouse. Leah felt no pity for him, but she felt the immense weight of the moment. This wasn't just about one case. It was about a system that had allowed officers like Bill to act without accountability for too long. As the trial proceeded, Leah fought to keep her emotions in check. She needed to stay neutral, to ensure justice was served. But the parallels between her own experience and the case in front of her were impossible to ignore. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the defense attorney presented his closing statement, trying to paint Bill as a well-meaning officer who had made a simple, honest mistake. But Leah knew better, and so did the prosecutor. Samantha Green rose for her final argument, her voice unwavering, her gaze directed firmly at the jury. "This case is not just about Kevin Daniels," she began. "It's about a pattern we've seen far too often in our justice system. It's about officers like Bill Wilkins, who look at a young black man in a neighborhood and decide he doesn't belong. It's about how these snap judgments lead to wrongful arrests, to humiliation, to injustice." Samantha's words echoed across the silent room, and it's time to say enough. As her words hung in the air, Leah sensed a shift in the room. The jury was listening, absorbing every word. By the time court adjourned for the day, Leah dismissed everyone but remained seated a moment longer, her mind racing. She had done her duty, presiding fairly over the case. But the incident outside the courthouse gnawed at her. It was a reminder that, no matter her title or accomplishments, her race would always color how some people saw her. The door to the courtroom opened quietly, and Sergeant Michael Harris, the older officer who had intervened earlier, stepped inside. His face was lined with concern as he approached the bench. "Judge Marshall," he said softly, "can I have a word?" Leah looked up, surprised. "Of course." Harris glanced around, making sure they were alone before he continued. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened earlier. With Wilkins," he began, a hint of discomfort in his voice. "He's not a bad kid, really, but he has blind spots, like a lot of them do." Leah's gaze met his, her expression unreadable. "Blind spots," she repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You mean racism?" Harris winced but didn't argue. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Probably. But I want you to know I'm trying to fix it, from the inside." Leah studied Harris for a long moment, searching his face. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that change was possible. But after everything she had seen, everything she had endured, hope felt like a fragile thing to hold on to. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with the weight of her experiences. "When I'm sitting here, day after day, hearing cases like this, knowing what I've been through firsthand?" Harris held her gaze, silent for a long beat before he finally spoke. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. Keep holding people accountable. It's the only way anything is going to change." Leah nodded slowly, though the weight of that responsibility still pressed heavily on her shoulders. The trial wasn't over yet, and there were more battles ahead, but for today, she had taken a step forward. As Harris left the courtroom, Leah glanced around the empty room, letting the silence settle over her. She knew the fight was far from over. But today, justice had been served, and that, she thought, was a start. The next morning, the air inside the courthouse was thick with anticipation. The jury had deliberated all night, and today would bring their decision. Leah sat in her chambers, trying to center herself for what was bound to be a pivotal moment, not just for this case, but for the many people watching across the country. This trial had become more than one man's wrongful arrest. It was a reflection of the very fabric of justice and the biases sewn into it. Leah sipped her coffee, staring at the files spread across her desk. Outside, the muffled sounds of reporters and protesters filtered in, their presence a reminder that this case had become a national story. Her thoughts drifted back to the previous day. Bill Wilkins, the officer who had profiled her, had sat in that very courtroom, shaken by the weight of his own testimony. She'd seen the tension in his face, the cracks in his voice. He wasn't an outlier. He was a product of a flawed institution. And Leah knew this case was bigger than making an example of one officer. It was about forcing a conversation that America had sidestepped for too long. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her. This trial symbolized the need to reform a system that allowed bias and profiling to fester unchecked. There was a knock on the door, pulling her back to the present. "Come in," Leah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Her clerk, Emily, stepped inside, holding a folder. "The jury's ready," Emily said softly. Leah nodded, rising from her chair. She took a deep breath, smoothing her robe. Let's do this. As she walked down the hallway toward the courtroom, her footsteps echoed, each step steady yet heavy with the weight of the moment. The courthouse felt different today. Tension hung in the air, not just in the courtroom but everywhere, pressing in from all sides. Inside, the atmosphere was stifling. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised, cameras ready. Family members of both Kevin Daniels and Officer Wilkins sat in the front rows, tense and waiting. Leah took her seat at the bench, her gaze falling on Kevin Daniels, who sat with his lawyer at the defense table. His expression was somber, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a hope that justice would be served, that this trial would make a difference. Shifting her gaze, Leah looked to Bill Wilkins. Today he seemed smaller, as though the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. His eyes darted around the room, his confidence drained. Leah cleared her throat, steadying herself. "Please bring in the jury," she announced, her voice firm as it echoed through the quiet room. The doors opened, and 12 jurors filed into the room. Leah watched them closely as they took their seats, studying their expressions, hoping to find a hint of their decision. But their faces were unreadable, eyes fixed straight ahead, betraying nothing. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with dark hair pulled tightly back, held a slip of paper in her trembling hands. Leah gave her a brief nod. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, her hands shaking slightly as she unfolded the paper, taking a steadying breath before speaking. "We have, Your Honor," she replied, her voice laced with the gravity of the moment. "Please read the verdict," Leah instructed, her own heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. The foreman glanced down at the paper, then raised her gaze, her voice steadier now. "In the case of Officer Bill Wilkins, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Leah looked toward Kevin Daniels. For a moment he sat motionless, his face expressionless, before a wave of relief washed over him. His lawyer gave him a congratulatory pat on the back, and Kevin's eyes shimmered with tears. He quickly blinked away. Leah then turned her gaze to Bill Wilkins. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale, hands tightly clenched. The weight of the verdict seemed to press down on him, his rigid posture on the verge of collapse. With a single, resounding strike of her gavel, Leah declared, "Court is adjourned." As the courtroom stirred to life, reporters scrambling for the exits, the public filing out, Bill suddenly rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he called, his voice cracking under the strain. Leah paused, looking down at him, her expression unreadable. The room quieted once more, every eye turning toward the young officer. He was visibly trembling, his face ashen as he struggled to find the words. I need to say." His voice faltered, and he looked down, gathering himself. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was wrong." His words wavered, thick with emotion. "I see now that I let my assumptions, my prejudices, cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry." A profound silence filled the room. Leah felt her breath catch, her heart tightening at his words. It was an apology, perhaps even sincere, but it wasn't enough. She thought about the countless times she had been in Kevin's place, stopped and questioned for no other reason than the color of her skin. This apology, however heartfelt, couldn't erase those experiences. She met his eyes, her voice steady yet firm. "Your apology is noted, Officer Wilkins, but the harm caused by actions like yours runs deep. It affects lives, families, and entire communities. Saying sorry doesn't fix that." Bill nodded, defeated. He didn't argue or attempt to justify himself further. He simply stood there, accepting the consequences of his actions. And for the first time, Leah saw a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. As the courtroom began to empty, Leah remained seated, watching as Kevin Daniels hugged his family, his face a blend of relief and exhaustion. By the exit, Bill Wilkins stood quietly, waiting to be escorted out, the weight of his guilt heavy on his shoulders. Leah's mind raced. She had done her duty, upheld the law, and presided fairly over this case. But it didn't feel like enough. This trial was just a single step in a vast ocean of injustice. For every Kevin Daniels who received a semblance of justice, there were countless others whose stories would remain unheard, whose cases would never see a courtroom. The door to the courtroom opened again, and Leah looked up to see Sergeant Michael Harris. Surprised, she watched him approach, his face a blend of concern and something else, something like hope. "Judge Marshall," he said softly, "can I have a word?" Leah gestured to the seat beside her. "Of course." Harris sat down, folding his hands in front of him. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Leah raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For handling this case the way you did," Harris replied. "For holding us accountable." "We need that. The system needs that," Harris said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Leah let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but it doesn't feel like enough. This was just one case." She paused, a heaviness in her voice. "There are so many more out there, so many people who don't get justice." Harris nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. But that's why we have to keep pushing. It's not going to change overnight, but every step matters. Every case like this chips away at the bigger problem." Leah fell silent, absorbing his words. She wanted to believe him, to believe that change was within reach. But after everything she had witnessed, holding on to hope felt like a struggle. "What about Wilkins?" she asked quietly. "What happens to officers like him, the ones taught to see things a certain way?" Harris sighed, the weight of his answer evident. "I won't lie, it's hard. There are a lot of guys like him. But there are also people like me, trying to change things from the inside. And I'll keep doing that as long as I can." Hey friends, sorry to disturb you. Please take a moment to share your name and where you're watching this video from in the comments. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Your support means the world to us and plays a crucial role in promoting our channel. Because of you, we can share these important stories and shed light on injustices. You inspire us, and together, we can make the world a better place. Enjoy the video. Leah looked at him, seeing the determination in his eyes. It mirrored her own resolve, despite the obstacles, despite the frustrations. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge," Harris said. "That's how we change this, piece by piece." Leah nodded slowly. "Piece by piece," she echoed, the words settling in her heart. As Harris left the room, she leaned back in her chair, her gaze resting on the empty courtroom. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today, they had taken one step forward. And that, she thought, was how change began. As the echoes of the verdict still lingered in the air, Leah remained seated at the bench, her mind buzzing with the weight of what had just transpired. This wasn't a victory she could fully savor. The trial was over, but its impact had only begun to unfold. For Leah, the fight for justice extended far beyond this courtroom. It reached into neighborhoods and communities, facing the same injustices that had brought Kevin Daniels to her bench. She stood, gathering her files, when a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Kevin Daniels, approaching her with his attorney by his side. His face was calm now, though the strain of the last few days was etched into his features. "Judge Marshall," Kevin began, his voice low but steady. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Leah paused, looking at him. "You don't need to thank me, Kevin. I was just doing my job." Kevin shook his head gently. "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through. You gave me a voice." Leah's chest tightened, understanding the weight of his words. She nodded, her voice soft. "I hope this is a step toward change," she replied carefully. "But it's just one case. There's still a long way to go." Kevin's eyes softened, a trace of hope visible. "I know, but it's a start, and for that I'm grateful." Leah watched him as he walked away with his attorney, a sense of purpose stirring within her. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much more left to do. One trial, one verdict. It wasn't enough to dismantle a system built over centuries. But Kevin was right. It was a start. Leah sighed deeply, her footsteps slow and deliberate as she made her way to her chambers. The front of the courthouse was swarming with media, so she opted for the side exit, hoping to avoid the cameras and microphones. But as she pushed open the door, Leah came face to face with Officer Bill Wilkins. He stood by the side of the building, leaning against the wall, his face drawn and pale. His uniform seemed to hang off him, as though the weight of the trial had somehow shrunk him. Leah stopped in her tracks, her heart thudding. For a moment neither spoke, the tension between them thick, a blend of guilt, anger, and unresolved questions. "Judge Marshall," Bill began, his voice hoarse as he straightened, his gaze locking onto hers. I didn't expect to see you here." Leah remained silent, her expression unreadable, waiting for him to continue. Bill took a shaky breath. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, each word weighted. "About everything, about what happened in there, and about what I did to you." He paused, his hands fidgeting by his sides. "I know saying sorry isn't enough. It won't fix what I did. But I need you to know, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Leah's eyes narrowed, her voice cold. She'd heard apologies like this before, too many times. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" she repeated, a hint of anger in her tone. "But it did happen, Officer Wilkins. And it keeps happening, to people like Kevin, to people like me." Bill winced, but he didn't back down. "I know I messed up. I know I let my biases take over, and I'm trying to understand that now. But it's not as simple as just unlearning everything overnight. I was taught to see things a certain way, and I never questioned it. Not until now." Leah crossed her arms, her gaze steady and unyielding. "And what changed now?" she asked. "Is it the fact that you got caught, or the fact that someone finally called you out?" Bill's face reddened slightly, and he looked down, nodding slowly. "Maybe both," he admitted. "I know that's not enough. I know I have a long way to go." Leah studied him in silence, her emotions a complex mix of doubt and reluctant hope. She wanted to believe that people like Bill could change, wanted to believe that the system could shift toward justice. But after all she'd seen, it was hard to let that hope in. "Piece by piece," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Bill looked up, meeting her gaze. "Yes, piece by piece." Leah gave him a curt nod before turning away, leaving him to his thoughts. She made her way back to the empty courtroom, the silence of the space offering a brief moment of solace. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today, they had taken one small step forward. And that, she reminded herself, was how change began. As the courtroom emptied and the echoes of the verdict lingered in the air, Leah Marshall remained seated at the bench. Her mind was buzzing with the weight of what had just transpired, but it wasn't a victory she could savor. The trial was over, but its impact was just beginning. For Leah, the fight for justice wasn't confined to the walls of this courtroom. It extended far beyond, into communities still struggling with the very issues that had brought Kevin Daniels here in the first place. She rose from her seat, gathering her files, when a quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Kevin Daniels, approaching with his attorney by his side. His face was calm now, though the tension of the past few days had clearly taken its toll. "Judge Marshall," Kevin began, his voice low but steady, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Leah looked at him, pausing. "You don't need to thank me, Kevin. I was just doing my job." Kevin shook his head gently. "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through. You gave me a voice." Leah felt her chest tighten. She understood exactly what he meant. After a moment, she nodded. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But it's just one case. There's still a long way to go." Kevin's gaze softened, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "I know, but it's a start. And for that, I'm grateful." She watched him walk away, his attorney close behind, and couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much more left to do. One trial, one verdict. It wasn't enough to dismantle a system built over centuries, but she knew Kevin was right. It was a start. Sighing, she began to make her way to her chambers, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The media had already swarmed the front entrance, so she opted for the side exit once again, hoping to avoid the barrage of cameras and microphones, and the inevitable microphones thrust in her face. But as soon as Leah pushed open the door, she found herself face to face with Officer Bill Wilkins. He stood by the side of the building, leaning against the wall, his face drawn and pale. His uniform seemed to hang loosely on him, as if the weight of the trial had somehow diminished him. Leah stopped in her tracks, her heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of guilt, anger, and confusion hanging heavily in the air. "Judge Marshall," Bill began, his voice rough as he straightened up, his eyes locking onto hers. I didn't expect to see you here." Leah remained silent, her expression unreadable as she waited for him to continue. She couldn't imagine what he might say that would make any difference, but she allowed him the moment. "I've been thinking," Bill said slowly, each word carrying weight, "about everything that happened in there, and about what I did to you." He paused, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I know that saying sorry isn't enough. It won't undo what I did, but I need you to know, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Leah's eyes narrowed, her voice turning cold. She'd heard apologies like this countless times before. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" she echoed, the skepticism evident in her tone. "But it did happen, Officer Wilkins, and it keeps happening. To people like Kevin, to people like me. So forgive me if I'm not moved by your remorse right now." Bill winced, but he didn't retreat. "I know I messed up," he admitted, his voice steadier now. "I know I let my biases take control, and I'm trying to understand that now. But it's not as simple as just unlearning everything overnight. I was taught to see things a certain way, and I never questioned it, not until now." Leah crossed her arms, her gaze unyielding. "And what changed now?" she asked, her voice sharp. "The fact that you got caught? Or the fact that someone finally called you out?" Bill's face reddened slightly, but he held her gaze, nodding slowly. "Maybe both," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that's not enough. I know I still have a long way to go." Leah held his gaze, her emotions a complex mix of frustration and reluctant hope. After a long moment, she simply nodded, then turned and walked away, leaving him to wrestle with his own conscience.